know how to do, or we haven't yet learned the tools to do, is to look beneath. I truly believe that the biggest problem we have in our communities, and I don't just mean in South Africa, I don't just mean in Europe, I don't just mean in the United States, but I mean around the world, and especially in the Muslim community. I think the deepest problem we have is trauma. Trauma is at the root of how we anchor. Trauma actually affects the way in which we are able to anchor ourselves to Allah, to our parents, and to our loved ones. And the way in which we anchor ourselves then gets carried on to all of our relationships. It definitely gets carried into marriage. And so when you want to talk about what is the underlying root cause of the pain and the suffering and the dysfunction, we have to go to our deep-rooted anchoring. What is our anchor? How healthy is our anchor? What are we anchored to? How do we anchor? In other words, talking about types of attachments. Now, attachment theory is one of the most important theories in psychology. In fact, some of the therapy based in attachment theory, it outdoes any other sort of therapy according to research developed by a woman named Sue Johnson. Emotion-focused therapy, for example, is a type of therapy whose effectiveness is far greater than any other type of therapy. Why? I mean, they found that traditional, maybe marriage therapy might be 15% effective, emotion-focused therapy about more than 70% effective. Why? Because it gets at the root of our attachments, at the root of our anchoring, and at the root of our attachment styles. But where does this come from? So I want to make you see that the way we anchor is relevant in our religious life. It's relevant in our spiritual life. It's relevant in our relationship with God. And it is also relevant in our relationship with ourselves. And it is also relevant in our relationship with others. And that's why we have to talk about our anchor, our attachments. First, I want to talk about the spiritual relevance. When we say La ilaha illallah, at the very root, at the very core of our Islam, of our surrender, what are we saying? Well, we're starting off by saying there is no object of worship. We're starting off by saying that there is no ilah, that there is no anchor. And then we introduce the exceptional illa. Illa in the Arabic language is to make an exception. So you make a blanket statement and then you make an exception. So except, illa. So there is no anchor. There is no ilah. Illallah. Except for Allah. That's what makes us Muslim, is this deep understanding. And it is not just as simple as there's no God but Allah. This is not a proper translation. Because it isn't that we're saying that the one we pray to is God only. That's not all we're saying. Yes, the one we pray to is God. But your ilah is more than just what you pray to. Your ilah is your foundation, your anchor. And so when you say La ilaha illallah and when you live La ilaha illallah, you are anchoring yourself in the only thing that is solid, in the only thing that doesn't change, in the only thing that doesn't die. You understand what that means? Allah doesn't die and everything else does. Kullu man alayha fan. Do we understand that? Do we actually internalize that reality? كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ. Every single thing will perish. Everything. Your money, your health, your status symbols, your relationships with the creation, everything will perish. Except for the countenance, the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the only thing that is lasting. And I remind you of myself about this reality because when we anchor ourselves to that which is perishing, we become so weak. What do we do when it falls apart? What do we do when our anchor falls apart? What do we do when our anchor leaves us or dies or gets sick or even goes to sleep? I think about this all the time because, have you ever been having a really intense discussion or argument with your spouse and then they just go to sleep? Does anyone else? Yeah. It's a thing, yeah? And how does that feel? Now, I'm going to begin by talking about where it started. Where did many of our core beliefs come from? And how do those core beliefs play out in our lives? Well, here's how the human being is designed. The human being is designed that whenever we sense threat, whenever we don't feel safe, our body switches from the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest system. It switches into what is called the sympathetic nervous system, also known as fight or flight. This is the part of our nervous system that is meant to keep us safe in cases of threat. So this is the part that would get triggered if you see a lion. This is the part that would get triggered if someone is chasing you with a gun, God forbid. But here's the problem. When a person grows up in an unsafe environment, and I'm going to define what that means. An unsafe environment in childhood includes lack of safety physically, lack of physical safety, the threat of physical harm. It includes lack of safety sexually, the threat of sexual harm. But it also includes lack of safety emotionally. Now, what does that mean? Because many of us understand trauma, capital T, where someone is physically or sexually abused, for example. But trauma can also be neglect. Trauma can also happen when you don't get the needs fulfilled that are required for healthy brain chemistry and healthy brain development. So another type of unsafe environment is if it is unsafe emotionally. What does that mean? It means when you grow up in a home where it wasn't safe to be authentic. It wasn't safe to express your feelings. It wasn't safe to express your needs. It wasn't safe to say no when you couldn't or didn't want to do something. It wasn't safe to disappoint. It wasn't safe to let people down. It wasn't safe to just be who you are and feel what you feel and express it. And so what happens is, whether it is physical, sexual harm, or it is emotional neglect or lack of safety, what happens is that human being develops what is called an insecure attachment style. In other words, their anchor is not secure. In this context, we are talking about the secure attachment to the parent. So in this context, the research shows that for a child to grow up emotionally healthy, to thrive in relationships, to be able to be resilient through challenges, to be able to get through conflict, etc., they needed to build what is called a secure attachment in childhood. And I'm talking, this is like in the first 3 years of life, especially the first 3 years. And psychologists say that the first 3 years are the most critical. 80% of the brain development happens in the first 3 years. Dr. Gabor Mate, one of the specialists in trauma, he says if you get the first 3 years right, you're basically good to go. Because secure attachment is built in those years. And if a person has a secure attachment, a healthy, secure attachment, then when they go into their adult relationships, they are able to have healthy relationships. He even cited that there was research to show that soldiers who went to war, they looked at which soldiers came out of war with PTSD and which did not. What's PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And they found something fascinating. They found that the soldiers who came out of war without getting these symptoms of PTSD were the ones who came from healthy childhoods. And those who did get PTSD were those who came from unhealthy childhoods. What does that say? Both of these groups are experiencing the same trauma. They're both going to war, but they're not coming out the same because one of them had the tools and the internal structure to be able to be resilient, and the other did not. You know, I heard this recently and I thought it was fascinating because it's so true. You know how the body was designed by Allah to heal itself, right? We know this. Like, the body actually can heal itself. But when does the body become unable to heal itself? When it is not healthy, when it is off balance. This is why naturopathy, for example, will be about getting the body back to balance so it can heal itself. We don't necessarily need medication if we can heal ourselves. But the problem is that our bodies are out of balance. Our bodies are not healthy. So it can't do what it was designed to do. You know, if you're not taking care of the health of the body, it can't do its job. Now, it's the same thing emotionally. See, if the person is emotionally and psychologically and mentally healthy because they had that secure attachment in childhood, then they are able to emotionally heal themselves in the sense that we are then equipped with the tools to be able to withstand and weather storms. The problem is the vast majority of us, we did not grow up in secure attached homes. And so we need to now talk about what is the consequence of that. How is that playing out in all of our lives? How is that playing out in our marriages? It is a fundamental factor in the health of our marriages. That's why when we talk about counseling, it's the counseling that goes to the root of the attachment styles, to the root of this that becomes the most effective. Because you're not just talking about the surface. You're not just talking about behaviors. I heard the psychologist talk about the difference between first order change and second order change. She said first order change is like moving the chairs on the Titanic. You can move the chairs around, but you haven't actually changed anything. You're still going to sink. And she said, second order change is real change. It's getting off the Titanic, getting in the lifeboat. And she gave an example about one of her clients that they kept fighting about whether or not someone was closing the toothpaste tube. And that might sound like, oh, that's so silly, right? On the surface, it's silly, isn't it? One of the spouses kept asking the other spouse to close the toothpaste tube, and the other spouse would one ear out the other, maybe do it for a day or two or three, and then just stop doing it. And it was driving the other spouse mad. Now, we all have a version of this. We all have a version of this, where it might look to someone on the outside or even to the other spouse like, why are you being petty? Why are you being so petty? And what the psychologist said is, it has nothing to do with the toothpaste. That you have to get to the underlying need that is not being fulfilled. In this case, the spouse who kept asking and was being dismissed and ignored was feeling like, am I not important? Do I not matter to you? Am I that unimportant that you just can't do the small thing that I've asked? You understand? So it's not about the toothpaste. And she said that when they were able to communicate that to the other spouse, they completely changed. And now they made sure to close the toothpaste. Why? Because it wasn't just first order change like, yeah. Because they actually understood at an attachment level. What is the attachment need that is not being fulfilled? And when you can communicate at that deeper level, you get deeper change. So when we talk about what happens now, right? Many of us, we didn't grow up in secure attachment. By the way, what is secure attachment? How is it built? There's an entire philosophy of parenting, sometimes called gentle parenting, sometimes called positive parenting, sometimes called authoritative parenting, where it is focused on building a secure attachment with your child. And the sort of fundamentals of this philosophy of parenting is, on the one hand, empathy, compassion, attunement. It means that you see your child, you validate their emotions, you let them know that they are safe to express their emotions, that emotions are not shamed, emotions are not dismissed, emotions are not punished, they are not ignored, but rather they are seen and they are held and they are validated. Now, when I say that, you might be like, but I'm going to spoil my kid if I do that. And the answer is no, because one of the second fundamental factors in this type of parenting is boundaries. So what they teach is that you have to hold boundaries, but with compassion. So the example that's given is your kid wants a cookie before dinner, and you can tell me what happens when you say no to a 2-year-old who wants a cookie before dinner. End of the world type of stuff. Now that child is going to throw a complete fit, temper tantrum. Do you know that that child is absolutely developmentally normal? That's absolutely developmentally normal. Why? Because the part of the brain that regulates and controls emotion is called the prefrontal cortex. And it is not fully developed until the age of 25 to 30 years old. And for some people, it doesn't ever fully develop. So, and I don't even just say that as a joke. No, but for real though, so jokes aside, it's actually a real thing. When someone is not um when someone is not raised in a healthy environment, emotionally healthy environment, their emotional age can be very, very stunted. And that's why they say, people like narcissists, for example, are somewhere around the emotional age of a 3 to 5 year old. Seriously. So what happens, and it's not just narcissists, but it's the fact that we don't realize, but when we were not given the proper attunement, all mental health, it basically goes back to, at some point, this human being did not get proper attunement. So if we're not given the proper attunement, it stunts our emotional development. In other words, it stunts our emotional maturity. And that is why we have many people walking around in adult bodies, but internally they are 6-year-olds, emotionally. And that is why when they are triggered, they go back to being 6 years old. And they go back, and I don't say that to be an insult. I say literally they go back to being that scared 6-year-old. So you can imagine what happens in marriage. Because now you get married and y'all know what happens next. You trigger each other. Marriage is basically a place to trigger each other. And that can be a good thing, because as one person said, nothing triggers you, it only reveals you. So what is it doing? It's pointing to your unhealed wounds. See, if I were to get a gunshot wound on my arm, but I cover it up, no one sees it, I ignore it, maybe I don't even realize, or I forget it's there, until someone just brushes against it. It could be the most gentle brush, and I scream. Why? That's a trigger. It's when my reaction does not fit what has happened because there is an internal wound. And this happened in childhood. So what happens now is that when you have two people and their wounds are being triggered. How do their wounds get triggered? I'll talk about that more in detail. But when their wounds get triggered, it's not a 35-year-old and a 40-year-old arguing, it's two 6-year-olds. Because when you're triggered, you go into your survival brain. If you were to look at brain scans, the prefrontal cortex, we said this is where we regulate emotion. Remember the kid who's having a temper tantrum? The 2-year-old, their prefrontal cortex isn't even developed. So they can't control their emotions. This is why they have meltdowns. This is why they have temper tantrums. But see, when you're triggered as a 45-year-old or a 55-year-old or a 35-year-old, your prefrontal cortex, it may be there, but it goes offline. It goes offline. And now you are, and I'm not just saying it metaphorically, like in brain scans. You are now literally in your survival brain, which is called the limbic system or the amygdala. And you're no longer thinking clearly at a very neurological level. You are only thinking of survival. In other words, when you're triggered, whoever or whatever is in front of you looks like a lion or a tiger. Can you imagine in marriage? But this is why it's so important to talk about this. Because if you don't know how to regulate your nervous system, if you don't know how to regulate your emotions, and you are constantly getting triggered into your survival brain, and you're constantly thinking threat, 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 I'm not safe, then what's happening is you have a husband and a wife, and they're both looking at each other as the tiger. You can imagine how that's going to go. You are the threat. You are the enemy. You are attacking me. And so now it's like any means necessary to do what? To defend yourself, to protect yourself, to survive this threat. You can imagine why that's not conducive to a healthy relationship, because you're going to be considering the other person the enemy. And this is why it's so important to learn how to, number one, heal those wounds so that you're not getting triggered as easily, and so that you're not going into this fight or flight survival brain, and so that you're not just trying to win or just trying to defend yourself. Going back to the kid with the cookie, because I want to talk about how this all began. We were children once, and that's when it was programmed. So going back to the cookie, see that 2-year-old who's throwing a temper tantrum because they want the cookie. There are 3 ways to respond, 3 philosophies of parenting. The first is what you and I are pretty much most accustomed to, and that's called authoritarian parenting. This is shut your mouth, or you're going to get, I'll give you something to cry about. Stop misbehaving. You're going to have a timeout. I'm going to spank you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the child is now punished for doing literally all the child knows how to do, because the child cannot regulate their emotions. Their brain is not developed to do so. And of course, they're disappointed that they can't have a cookie. That's like their whole world at that age. So you're telling them something that is so devastating, and they don't yet have a developed prefrontal cortex to control their emotion and their reaction. And then you're punishing them for that, when they're actually acting completely behaviorally normal. That's absolutely normal for that age. The second option or response is the opposite, which is called permissive parenting. Permissive parenting, once the child freaks out, the parent will be like, okay, fine, you can have the cookie. Now, the problem with permissive parenting is that you're reinforcing the behavior, number one, and you're also not sticking to protecting the child, because it's not healthy for them to have a cookie for dinner. That's permissive. It doesn't have boundaries. We said the authoritarian is punishing the child for having emotion, and the permissive is giving in when they shouldn't, because they're supposed to be keeping the child safe and healthy. Now, what is the middle, which is all about creating a secure attachment? It is to validate the emotion of the child. I can see that you're very upset. You're very angry because I didn't give you a cookie. I totally understand that. But I'm sorry, you still can't have the cookie. So what it is it's validation, attunement with boundaries. And that's the philosophy of building a secure attachment. One of the most toxic things that we see in authoritarian parenting, which is what many of us are accustomed to. We grew up with that type of parenting, which is very focused on control. Authoritarian parenting is it's very focused on, I'm the parent, I'm in control, I'm in charge, and you obey. Now, that is extremely unhealthy for several reasons. One of the reasons is that you should never make your goal raising a child who is blindly obedient to you. And I'll tell you why. Because a child who is blindly obedient to you will be very easy to take advantage of. Why? Well, because if you've taught them that you must blindly obey adults, then when an adult comes and wants to take advantage of them, or harm them or oppress them, they will stay quiet. And that's part of the training that they got, because they were told, you blindly obey authority. Very dangerous. We only blindly obey Allah. We don't blindly obey anyone else, even the parent. So this is also not healthy. Yes, there needs to be boundaries taught of respect, but that goes both ways. And yes, your job is to hold boundaries to keep your child safe. You can't just give in and do whatever they want. But if the focus is control over connection, you're going to suffer and that child's going to suffer, because that's not a secure attachment. And it becomes a lot easier for that child to be taken advantage of and a lot harder to speak up. So what happens now when the insecure attachment is now taken into adult relationships? I'm going to talk about two types of insecure attachments, which pretty much make up many of our relationships in specific marriage. The first type of insecure attachment style is called anxious attachment. And the preoccupied or anxious attached is a person who grew up in a home where there was some sort of abandonment. Either there was emotional abandonment or physical abandonment. This is a person who learned early in life that the people you love will leave, or they may leave, or they may abandon you. And so this person carries this deep anxiety around relationships, which is rooted in what is called an abandonment wound. How does that play out in their future relationships? These are people who are very preoccupied with, distance. If they feel like someone is mad at them, they become very anxious. They will replay conversations in their mind over and over. Did I what did I say wrong? Are they mad at me? It's a person who has a lot of anxiety around relationships. And this gets triggered anytime they feel distance, emotional distance. Why? What is it rooted in? It's rooted in an abandonment wound from childhood. Now, there's another type of insecure attachment called dismissive avoidant. This is what you might consider the opposite, but it is still rooted in not having your emotional needs met in childhood. But this one goes to the other side, and this is usually the men. So the women tend to go more anxious, and the men tend to go more dismissive avoidant. Now, what is a dismissive avoidant? A dismissive avoidant is someone who grew up in a home where emotions were completely neglected. Someone who grew up in a home where emotions were either ignored, denied, shamed, or even punished. So, for example, we'll use example of men. The little boy is crying. So he's showing a normal human emotion of sadness, and he is told, stop crying, stop acting like a baby, man up, don't be a girl, etc., etc. He is shamed, he is punished, and he learns that it's not okay to feel. And of course, this can happen to girls as well. Usually this happens with girls in terms of anger, where girls are told if they're angry, that anger is not something you're allowed to feel or you will be rejected. Now, I want to remind you that every emotion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created was created for a purpose. Allah doesn't make mistakes. And so every emotion is actually a messenger. It's telling us something. It's serving a purpose for us, even sadness, even anger. Your anger is, if you think about your home, see the walls around your home, see the front door, See the electric fence? That's only in South Africa, by the way. See these protections you put around your house? The walls, the door, the fence. Those are called boundaries. Those are your boundaries. If you do not have boundaries, what happens? Anyone can come in and do whatever they please. And this is why it's so dangerous not to have boundaries. It's like you knock down the walls in your house. You remove the electric fence and you don't have a front door. Are you going to be safe? Absolutely. This is South Africa. Anywhere. You would never leave your front door open. And yet many of us, we do this because we don't have boundaries. But see the alarm that's around the house that goes and it starts to go off when someone is trespassing or encroaching, is overstepping the boundaries. See that alarm? That's healthy anger. But many of us were taught to take out the batteries. You're not allowed to feel anger. Good girls don't get angry. And so what that does is it's like a person who's taken out the batteries from the security system. So anytime someone is overstepping or being unjust or crossing boundaries, you don't get angry anymore because you've learned to suppress it. And guess what happens when you do that? So a recent study out of Stanford found that there was a correlation between autoimmune disease and the suppression of healthy anger. And now I'm going to mention oldest daughters. You all know who you are. It's a real thing. I'll tell you this. I was doing a retreat, one of my retreats on healing the emptiness. And I kid you not, I think every single person there was an oldest daughter. Why does that happen? Well, the oldest daughters tend to play a certain role in the family. And that is that they are the ones responsible to save the world. They are the ones responsible to carry everyone else, to be responsible to fix everyone else, even responsible for everyone else's emotions. And this is why oldest daughters tend to be people pleasers. Wow. What is a people pleaser? A people pleaser is someone who learned early in childhood that you better not upset or disappoint the people around you. Because if you disappoint, upset, say no, don't be pleasant, don't suppress, you won't be safe, or you will be rejected, or you won't be loved, or you won't be the good girl. Y'all know Elsa and Anna? Frozen? Yes or no? Okay. You're afraid Majlis will hear you and Elsa, the oldest daughter, has oldest daughter syndrome. Conceal, don't feel. Never let it show. Be the perfect girl you always have to be. You guys getting it? And then there's Anna. It's so funny because it's so accurate. You know the second daughter? You know what I'm talking about? Now I'm talking to you. You all need to thank your older sister. Because it's because of her that you can be like Anna. But you're just free. You're the rebel, you're the free one. Because you know what? You can live your best life because she took the role of carrying the world. And I know that's the case in my family. My older sister did that role, but to her own detriment in a lot of ways. So I get to be the Anna. And then my younger sister, she just gets to do whatever she wants. No, I'm just kidding. At some point, we have to realize that it's not on us to carry the weight of the world. And it was never our job to be responsible for the feelings of others. There is a difference between being compassionate and caring and feeling like it's your job to please everyone. People pleasing, and you may not have realized this, people pleasing is a trauma response. It comes from an environment where you had to live in what is sort of like a minefield. You know, a minefield is where you don't know where you step, where it might explode. It's like that. It's an environment where it's not safe to just be honest and authentic. It's an environment where you might have been around an explosive parent or someone who never learned to regulate their own emotions. And so you learned to ignore yours or to suppress yours. Now I want to just, inshallah, get to how this dynamic works when the avoidant marries the anxious. So the lovely thing is, avoidants tend to marry anxious. So here's how it plays out. On the one hand, you have the person who sees emotional distance as a threat. They become very anxious. They will pursue. They will chase. They will over-explain, over-apologize, try to people please, everything they can to bring closeness again because they have an abandonment wound. And the fun part is that they're married to someone who's actually triggered by closeness. Right? You get it? If you want to understand your life, this is actually the explanation. I cannot tell you how much I was like, so see, all this like terminology is like accessible now. And I'm like, where the heck was this when I was struggling? I would have loved to know what was going on, but this is what's going on. See, the dismissive avoidant grew up in a home where emotions were not okay. Emotions were shunned. They were neglected. They were ignored. They were shamed. They were punished. And so he learned to disconnect from his own emotions. He learned, or she, but usually he, learned that the only way to survive is to suppress emotion, to completely disconnect from them. So this individual is overwhelmed by emotion, and that is why they either attack or shut down. So here's how the dynamic works, right? Person A, will say that's the wife, will say that she has an anxious attachment style. She comes to the husband with something that has upset her, that he has done. So she comes to him and said, you know, when this happened, when you said this, when you did this, it upset me. What does he hear if he has a dismissive avoidant attachment style? He hears, you're saying I'm a failure. You're saying I'm the worst husband ever put on God's earth. You're saying that I am worthless. So what's happening is his wound is being triggered. The wound of the avoidant is called a defectiveness wound. It's a person who deep down thinks that they are broken, that they are defective, that they are not capable of giving you what you want. And so every time you complain, that's being triggered. And it triggers actually their shame. And so when shame is triggered, you actually go to your survival brain and you go back to what you know to survive. So you're saying that I am a failure. I am the worst husband ever to walk the earth. And the more emotional you are, the more he'll hear that. But now what does he do as a response? Well, you're telling me I'm a failure. Nobody wants to feel that they're a failure. So what will he do? He will defend himself. How does he defend himself? Well, by telling you that you're wrong. No, I didn't do that. No, that didn't happen. No, that's not accurate. No, that's invalid. No, you're too emotional. No, you're too sensitive. No, you're insecure. No, you're on your period. Right? Am I telling lies? But see what that is? That's him defending the attack on him, which he feels so deeply because it's touching a wound he has from childhood that told him that, number one, emotions are scary, emotions are not safe, and that he is defective. And so he will do anything to deflect from feeling that shame. So the first line of defense is typically defensiveness. The defensiveness is the one that involves, if she says, you hurt me when this happened, and he says, no, I didn't, that didn't happen, you're too sensitive, you're imagining it. It's basically gaslighting. It's to dismiss, it's to kind of invalidate it. Now, what does that do to the anxious person who basically felt unseen and invalidated their whole life? Well, makes them more upset. Because now you're not validating what I'm saying, so now I have to defend it. So now I have to get more and more upset to prove that I have a right to be upset. And the more upset she gets, the more defensive he gets, and the more he's like, you're just crazy at this point. So lovely, so fun. And then after defensiveness isn't working, sometimes they'll move to shutdown. Complete shutdown. So this can be leaving the room, leaving the house, picking up their phone. This is called stonewalling. Completely shut off, done, I don't hear, you're not talking, you don't exist. Go to sleep, that's another fun one. See, all this dynamic is dysfunctional, but where is it coming from? It's coming from the childhood insecure attachments. We didn't learn in childhood how to regulate our emotions because our parents didn't teach us. Our parents didn't teach us because they were never taught. And they were never taught because their parents were never taught. And this is how generational trauma gets passed on. So what's the solution? I guess that's the question. The solution is, and I want to give you the good news. The good news is all of this can be rectified. The good news is that all of this can be healed. All of this can be rewired. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the brain have neural plasticity, meaning that it can actually be changed. It can be retrained. But the answer is we have to recognize it first and then go deep into the core wounds. How do we do that? Awareness is step one. And then step two is realizing that there's no shame in getting